We have the privilege this evening to hear from a dynamic speaker. Amy Simpson, let me tell you a little bit about her. She's a speaker, a writer, an inner strength coach. I love the idea of that, inner strength. She helps leaders get clear on their calling and fortify their resources so they can fully engage in a life with guiding purpose. She's a creative professional and a former publishing executive. She has a heart for the creative leader. A woman of faith, she believes in the importance of healthy faith communities. She's developed a strong conviction that each person's life has a purpose, and the points of crisis are opportunities for transformation. I'm going to write that down. Points of crisis are opportunities for transformation. She holds an English degree from Trinity International University, an MBA from the University of Colorado, and a CPCC certification from Coaches Training Institute. She loves to travel. She has 2 teenage daughters, one of which is driving, she tells me, and a lovable dog named Rosie. She lives in the suburbs of Chicago, and she's here to speak with us this evening. And let me just share with you, on her website, she says she has a heading, Nice Things People Say About Me, which I think is very cool. And let me read this quote. Amy Simpson is one of the smartest, most professional, organized, thoughtful, and fun people I have ever met and worked with. She inspires and motivates those who work around her. She is great. Another quote, she's creative, amazingly talented writer, editor, and leader. Her kindness, humor, and talent are an asset to any team fortunate enough to work with her. And this evening, she's here with us. Join me in welcoming Amy to the stage, please.
Wow, that's a lot to live up to. Thank you for letting me be here with you this evening. I'm so glad to be part of this celebration. And, you know, I travel around the country and speak at a lot of different kinds of events, a lot of them related to mental health issues and to how faith communities can come alongside people and help. And I don't know that I've been to one celebrating an organization that's been around and doing this for 25 years. So I'm really inspired by what's happening here. I get to see some inspiring things happening in faith-based support for individuals and families affected by mental health issues. But I don't know if you realize that this is a pioneering ministry. There aren't a lot of organizations that have been doing this as long as No Longer Alone Ministries has been. So I'm impressed and just grateful that I get to be part of this. Well, because I've written on this topic and I've done a lot of research on the subject of mental health and churches, faith communities, I know more about mental illness than the average person, but I know a lot less about it than some of the people in this room. But the thing that really qualifies me to stand up here and talk, and I have this in common with, I think, a lot of other people in this room, is that I know what it's like to love and live with someone who has a serious mental illness. Often when I speak, I provide a lot of training and education. I talk about ideas. But I think this group already understands many of the issues around this. So tonight I want to focus on sharing some of my own story and what I've learned on my journey. I grew up in the Midwest, and this is a picture of my family, obviously a long time ago. I'm not the mom in that picture, even though I look a lot like her. I'm actually the really cute one there. I grew up in this family, a loving family, and I was one of 4 kids, obviously, in the family. And until I was 13 years old, my dad was a pastor, and he pastored small, rural congregations. So we lived in small farming communities and actually lived in parsonages next door to churches out in the country. So when I wasn't reading, which was actually most of the time, I spent a lot of time running around in the wide open spaces between our house and the church, and got to know, the sound and smell of cattle and corn. As I said, my family was loving. My mom was a gentle and kind person most of the time, but she was also unusual in some troubling ways. My mom had trouble reading books or following presentations when I was growing up. Sometimes she had a hard time focusing on what other people were saying to her. She would just get confused in a conversation. It was hard for her to start or carry on conversations. And sometimes she struggled to relate to other people or just to express what she was thinking, even a very simple thought. Occasionally, she just couldn't quite express it in a way that other people could understand. She often couldn't express emotions, or she had a hard time expressing them appropriately. And sometimes she said things that just didn't quite make sense to other people. My mom sometimes showed surprising lapses in judgment, and making decisions came very hard for her. One of the most striking things I remember about my mom in my childhood years was her social withdrawal, even from me and my siblings. She was, in many ways, inaccessible as a person. She would go off by herself, or she would sort of zone out when she was with us or with other people, and it was just hard to reach her. Sometimes she seemed distant, and she didn't really have any close friends. I don't remember my mom ever really having a friendship. But when you're young, you usually think your family's pretty normal. In fact, probably the definition of normal, even if they're abnormal. And although I knew my family was a bit unusual in a few ways, I didn't think anything was wrong. I didn't know there was a significant problem. That is, until I was a teenager. Now, when I was 13, my dad left his job as a pastor at the church we were at. And my family moved from this rural community to the city, like right into kind of the inner city. And my dad was unemployed for a long time. And when he did find work, it was in temporary and minimum wage jobs that could not support a family of 6. Now, rural pastors are not generally known for their wealth, and my family had never had much money, but now we lived in full-on poverty. In fact, we were living on public assistance, and the whole family at the same time was dealing with culture shock. We had moved, from one kind of community to a very different kind of community. My parents' marriage was tense, and we were all tremendously stressed. And we were required to make, some significant adjustments. At the same time that this move happened, my brother, who was the oldest among us, graduated from high school and left home. And my teenage sisters and I each had our own room in the parsonage we had left. And now we were crammed into a small bedroom we shared with each other, which if you have teenage girls, as I do, perhaps you can imagine how much stress and tension and conflict was inherent in that situation. Now, this was a difficult time for us, but these are the kinds of transitions and adjustments that families often have to make. This was not an exceptional situation necessarily. It was a difficult one, and it required a lot of us. But eventually, my siblings and my dad and I adapted to our new circumstances. We made the best of things. We learned to live and relate to people in a brand new place, and we eventually began to thrive. But this time period created more stress and tension for my mom than she could navigate, because as we didn't really understand at the time, her mental health was already very fragile. She just didn't have the resources to handle this transition. So she began to deteriorate. She started to zone out more and more. She started behaving strangely in ways that sometimes scared us. She grew more fragile, and we all noticed and worried about her and really didn't know what to do. So one day, my sisters and I got together and kind of acknowledged what was happening. And we went to my dad and said, "Dad, there's something wrong with Mom. What can we do? Can we find some kind of help for her?" Well, my dad agreed, and I think this conversation kind of gave him permission to admit and face what he was already aware of. But my family, remember, was under-resourced. We really did not, we had very few resources at our disposal. We were new, or relatively new, in the community, and we didn't have a ministry like No Longer Alone. So my dad didn't know where to go. But he was able to find eventually a counselor who was willing to see my mom on a pro bono basis for a few sessions. My mom did go to work with that counselor, but frankly, that counselor was in over his head. and did not understand the severity of what my mom needed and was facing. Well, my mom's troubling behavior grew worse until one day when I was 14. I was on the track team at high school, and after track practice, my dad would pick me up on his way home from work. Well, one day, as I was waiting for my dad to pick me up after practice, he didn't arrive. And I continued to wait a little longer, and then when he still didn't show up, I called home. And a neighbor answered the phone, one of our next door neighbors. When I asked her what was going on, she said, "Your mom had to go to the hospital. I think she had a stroke or something." So I walked home from school, and I had made that walk before. It was, about a 2-mile walk. It wasn't, wasn't something exceptional necessarily. But I specifically remember the walk that day still, because it was a terribly scary and emotional experience for me, walking toward home, not knowing what I would find there and not knowing what had happened to my mom. I was wondering and worrying the whole time what had happened to her. I remember thinking, is my mom terribly sick? Is she dying? I was familiar with the term stroke, and I had a little bit of experience with that, but I didn't really understand what a stroke was. And because that was the term my neighbor had used, that was the term I kept wondering about. What happens to people who have strokes? Would I see my mom again? Had I lost her? Well, as it turned out, my neighbor was wrong. I had lost my mom that day, but not to death, not to the physical consequences of a stroke or anything like it. My mom had suffered a psychotic break that was so severe she had completely lost the ability to function in any way. She had gone to a psychiatric hospital. Now, later my family discovered this was not my mom's first psychotic episode. Far from it. She had suffered many others. But it was the first time she was disabled by her psychological condition and unable to hide what was happening with her. Much later, I learned that what I had lost her to was called schizophrenia. And I would lose her many more times in the years to come. Although it was many years before my family really understood my mom's diagnosis, schizophrenia became a new member of our family starting that day, and it changed the way we all lived. My mom was hospitalized multiple times when I was in high school, and each time she returned home with bottles of pills that controlled most of her symptoms and really helped her. But they made her miserable with their side effects. She didn't like to take them. But she would take them and she would sit on the couch and kind of stare off into space. And then as she started to feel a little bit better, she'd start shuffling around the house and kind of trying to care for her family. And then when she started feeling even better, eventually she would decide she didn't need to take those pills anymore. So the cycle would repeat itself, as it often does for people who have an illness like hers. And we learned to live with her that way. And we learned to live without her. When she was home, we cared for her. We let her care for us the best she could because it seemed important to her and because it was important to us to have some sense of normalcy in our lives. But we didn't really have the luxury of needing her anymore, so we didn't. Neither did we have the luxury of seeking sympathy and support in the people around us. We knew, as everyone did, I thought, that we weren't supposed to talk about mental illness. We got the message that we were alone, that we were worthy of shame, and we were supposed to pretend everything was fine. So that's what we did. One day when I was 15 years old, my mom had been doing relatively well for a season, and she picked me up at school to take me to a dentist appointment. Well, as soon as I got in the car, I was, by that time, very sensitive to my mom's moods and symptoms. And as soon as I got in the car, I realized immediately that she wasn't functioning normally. I recognized the warning signs that she was headed for another episode of some kind. and it scared me. My mom was driving the car. She drove nervously. It was as if she were struggling to be fully aware of her surroundings and maybe even imagining surroundings that weren't there. She was silent, except when I forced conversation with her. And when she did speak with me, her speech was slow and seemed to require a lot of deliberation. Her interaction with me was indirect and stiff, and it was as if she were not fully aware that I was there with her, as if she was struggling with the decision of whether to shrink into some unknown place or maintain her grip on reality and her daughter and a trip to the dentist. Well, I know I was 15 at the time because I remember thanking God that I could legally take over driving if I needed to, because I had my learner's permit. And I'm not sure how I thought that was going to work, but it brought me some comfort and a little bit of a sense of control in the situation. And I remember asking my mom whether she had taken her medication that day, and her answer was not straightforward. But it was clear even from that for whatever reason, my mom was not fully medicated and stable. So with one part of my brain, I asked God for a safe trip to the dentist. And with another part, I employed a technique I often used, which is used by many people who feel powerless in the face of something they don't understand. I soothed myself by acting as if nothing was wrong. Well, we did make our way safely to the dentist's office, and we sat down to wait in the waiting room. And when my name was called, I left my mom there in the waiting room, and I went back for my appointment. And when I did that, I stepped away from my anxiety about her for the moment. And this is something I usually did. This was part of how I coped with this devastating stress and my inability to really understand what was happening in my family. When I walked away from my family, when I left home, I usually kind of forgot all about this because I just wanted to be a normal kid with a normal family. So after about half an hour or so with the dentist, I returned to the waiting room and I approached my mom, and she didn't look at me. And I said, "Mom, it's time to go. I'm finished. I'm done with the dentist." And I received no response from her. And I suddenly realized in an instant that my instincts had been right. And my earlier fear had been realized, and something was wrong with Mom again. And this time, it was up to me to help her. So I touched her arm, and I gently tried to shake her back to awareness, with no results. My mom was rigidly catatonic, immovable, staring into space and clutching her purse in her lap with clenched hands in a waiting room full of strangers. Well, after a couple of quiet attempts to rouse her, I began to attract attention. People sat and stared at me as I tried to get her to respond, and I thought, if I could just get her to the car, if I could just get her out of here, I can take her to the hospital, I can take her home or whatever, but I just got to get out of here. But when my mom wouldn't move or even respond to me, I realized that wasn't going to happen. I would not be able to get her to the car. So I thought, I'll call my dad at work for help. So with everyone in the room continuing to stare, I walked over to the reception desk and I asked the woman behind the counter, who was also staring, if I could use the phone. And she said, "No, there's a payphone around the corner." So I explained, I just need to call my dad for help, and I don't have change for the phone. This is back in the day. And it would be a local call. She still refused, and she pointed me to the payphone. So I went back to my mom, and in a terrible moment of indignity, I wrestled with my mom's rigid arms to get into her purse just to find that quarter for a phone call to get help. I went back to the receptionist and I asked her if she could just keep an eye on my mom while I used the payphone, and she shrunk back in horror. "Is she dangerous?" she asked. Well, I assured the receptionist that my completely motionless and non-responsive mother was not poised to attack her, and I called my dad. And my dad worked on what was basically kind of a factory floor situation, so it wasn't easy to reach him. So I had to wait a while before I finally got to talk to him. And once I did, he said he'd be there just as soon as possible. So I returned to sit next to my mom and wait for him to arrive. And while I waited, the receptionist and the people in the waiting room took turns staring at my mom, glancing at me quickly, and studying the floor. And not one person in that room asked me, a completely rational 15-year-old kid, whether I needed help. Now, I tell you that story not just because it's important to me or because it's a significant incident in my life, but because I have often thought back to that specific incident as a reference point for attitudes toward people with mental illness and their families. The way people in that waiting room responded to my family's public crisis is the way I've seen people tend to respond to serious mental illness. To them, my mother was automatically someone to be feared, and I was somehow infected by my association with her. The people around me felt helpless and fearful, and I have no doubt that some of them may have wanted to help or wondered how they could help, but they were afraid and they felt overwhelmed and they refused to get involved. And I knew my mother's illness was a shameful secret. And even though I was sitting in that room surrounded by other people, my family was alone. Well, as the years marched on from there, my family continued to walk through decades that brought a string of run-ins with the harsh effects of my mom's disease. Difficult and broken relationships, paranoid fear, many hospitalizations, public embarrassment, religious confusion, occult activities, homelessness, danger, arrest and conviction, prison time. We have been through periods of stability and hope, followed by another slow or sometimes sudden loss of the person we know and love. Battles with shame and stigma that keep us quiet and isolated from each other for decades. Battles for the life and well-being of a woman we cherish, who still has a purpose and a place in this world. And here's one of the most important things I have learned along this journey. God is not defeated by mental illness. If you are affected by mental illness, whether it's your own or that of someone you love, you know that when people of faith are silent on this subject, as they often are, that silence can cause a variety of injuries. Perhaps among the cruelest of these is the implication that people with mental illness have no purpose or place in God's kingdom. So here is one thing I want everyone to know. And if you take away one thing from this evening, maybe it'll be what somebody else said, but if it's something I said, I hope it's this. God always has a purpose for everyone. Our world tends to marginalize people who suffer from mental illness, disabilities, and other conditions that make them obviously different from most of us. Mental illness may alter the course of a person's life, and managing it may come with limitations, but it does not mean that person's life is no good anymore. Psalm 139 is a beautiful reminder of our value to God and of God's attention to the details of our lives. Verse 16 celebrates, "You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed." I am convinced that God is not surprised by our suffering. Mental illness does not catch God off guard. And he wants to use all of us, regardless of the form our afflictions take. God also wants to redeem our suffering. Sometimes this means he'll use that suffering to make us more like the people he wants us to be, even if it's not the people we thought we were. Sometimes it means our suffering will become a way for us to show God's love and grace to someone else. Maybe both. We may never realize how God uses what we've been through, but he will, especially as we welcome his work in and through us. God wants to take you on a journey from pain to purpose, a journey like the one he has me on and has had me on for my whole life. 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 11 tells us that our suffering bodies, and by the way, your brain is a part of your body, are valuable to God's work. It says, through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. Our bodies may be fragile, they're often broken, but for Christians, they carry the presence of God's Spirit in this world, like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. Mental illness does not change the fact that we are called to represent God in these bodies. And good news for those of us who want to see God's power work through us and who feel we're limited. As Christ told the Apostle Paul, my power works best in weakness. As people of faith, when it comes to this kind of ministry, this is our calling. I wrote a book called Troubled Minds, Mental Illness and the Church's Mission. And I wrote this to help people in the church better understand the needs of people affected by mental illness. I also wrote it to challenge people of faith, to challenge the church, that's everyone who follows Christ, to see this as part of our mission in this life. Let me ask you, is there any ministry more fitting for people who follow Jesus? In Jesus' ministry on earth, no one was outside the margins of his notice. No one was unworthy of his attention, too sick for his healing, too dirty for his touch. Jesus loved to surprise those who were usually ignored simply by noticing them. He loved to heal the ones everybody thought were beyond hope. He taught us, God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Those who most acutely feel their need for God are blessed in his eyes. And we are blessed as we serve them. As I wrote in my book, the church should not lag, it should lead the way. We serve a God who calls us to serve the least of these as if we were serving him. Jesus said, healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. As living temples carrying God's presence with us in this world, we must allow his light to shine out from us and infiltrate the darkness that surrounds so many people and sometimes drives some of them to despair. God's heart is open toward those who are open to him. Christ came to save those who were aware of their need, and we are called to the needy as well. This is our calling. Let's embrace our calling and shine the light of Christ in the darkness. We are called to light the way on the journey from pain to purpose. A couple of years ago, after my mom, again, relapsed and stopped taking her medication, she spent several months living in a secure assisted living facility. And this was a place that was not designed specifically for people with mental health issues, but who was willing to house my mom and give her a safe place to stay and to recover. And this was a huge blessing to my family. One more piece in the puzzle that has come together in the last few decades to show my family we are not alone after all. So this place was a real blessing to my mom and to my family because my mom had this safe place to live and to recover and just to get better. So my family, my husband and my children and I went to visit her at Christmas time a couple of years ago. And while we were there, we met some of her friends. And one of them who told us about the tremendous influence that my mom was having on the other residents there. This man told us that he was not a person of faith, but he recognized the presence of Christ in my mom's life. Because of my mom, he said, the other residents had more hope and joy in their lives. Because of her, people felt listened to. They felt like they had a friend because my mom was willing to be their friend. My mom had made a difference in this place simply because she was there. And because my mom had made it for him, he had a Christmas ornament hanging in his apartment. And it was simply an artistic rendering of the name Jesus. And it wouldn't have been there if my mom had not been there. This experience took me by surprise because, when I walked into that place, all I was thinking about was how grateful I was that they had served my mom, that they had given her a place to become more stable. It was not even on my radar that my mom was there to serve people too, that my mom had a purpose in being there, even though when she got there, she didn't even know her name. She didn't even sleep in her room at night because she was scared of who knows what. So these kind folks at this place, they let her sleep wherever she wanted. And you know where she chose to sleep? On a bench right outside the doors of the chapel. But my mom had gotten better there. And then suddenly I was able to see she had a purpose and a reason for being there. This was part of God's plan for her. God was able to use this. So this taught me something important which I didn't realize I needed to learn, honestly. My mom was not there just to get better. She was there to bring light and love into that place too. I believe everyone's life has a purpose, and my mom's purpose was not canceled because she has a serious illness. For me, in my life, the shame of having this in my family is completely gone. And that's why I'm standing up here. I'm not embarrassed of my mom's illness. I am proud of the ways she's living with it. I'm proud of how hard she has fought for her life and for her family. Schizophrenia may still do more brutal and destructive work on this woman, but my eyes will stay open to it. I am no longer afraid to take the emotional risks inherent in loving her. In the last few years, through the work God has placed before me, I have found myself on stage like this many times, sharing stories, helping to educate, giving ideas. I've had the precious privilege of being there, and I can see it in people's eyes from up front often, when countless people realize for the first time that they are not alone in this experience. I have seen the burden of isolation lift from their shoulders, and it's beautiful. I've seen God redeem my family's pain by using it to bless others and to help others recognize their own calling. I never dreamed I would have an opportunity like this one. In fact, I'll tell you, this was really the last subject I thought I would write about, to be honest, because this was, our family secret. It's not a secret anymore. I encourage you to take heart and find hope in knowing that mental illness does not make anyone marginal to God's plans. God is in the business of redemption, and regardless of how we may see people with mental illness, he sees every single person for who we are and loves us all more than we can imagine. In God's grace, we can extend that same kind of loving vision toward one another. We can see each other through the eyes of the Spirit, who helps us see the value and potential in one another. This is the right posture for ministry to people affected by mental illness. This is the right posture for ministry to anybody. Regardless of our mental health, we are all equally valuable in God's eyes, and all of Christ's followers have a place and a purpose in his kingdom. Our limitations do not limit God. People with mental illness are precious to him, and they should be precious to the rest of us. We are called to light the way on the journey from pain to purpose. And the work of people like the folks at No Longer Alone Ministries matters to so many people. I mean, that's very clear to me being here tonight. It's very unusual to have a ministry like this have such a strong place in a community. Take my word for it. It's true. There is hope here. No one has to be alone. Let's help people move from pain to purpose. Thank you for your time.